Hi everyone, today we will be learning about ancient Egypt. We know quite a bit about this civilization thanks to the many monuments, objects, and artifacts that have been recovered from various archaeological sites. Many pyramids, temples, statues still stand, which have given us insight into the Egyptian world. We've also recently been able to decipher the hieroglyphics that have covered many of these remaining monuments, objects, and artifacts thanks to the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was a stone found that had 3 languages on it: Ancient Greek, hieroglyphics, and Demotic script, which was another language used by Egyptians. Because we understand Ancient Greek, we were able to decipher hieroglyphics and figure out what they stand for. Ancient Egypt began in 3100 BC, also known as BCE, and lasted until 30 BCE, also known as BCE. However, the pre-dynastic period actually started 2,000 years before this in 5000 BC. During this pre-dynastic period, Egypt was divided into 2 kingdoms, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Both kingdoms were united around 3100 BC by King Menes. King Menes made Memphis the capital and began the dynasties of the pharaohs. And a dynasty is a ruling family, meaning power is passed on from generation to generation. Egypt was conquered by a variety of groups, by the Persians, Nubians, Greeks, and Romans. And so many of the cultures have blended together to leave the remnants of history that we see today. As many of you may know, Egypt is located in northeastern Africa and is in the middle of the desert. We've got the Sahara Desert to the west, the mountainous eastern desert and Red Sea to the east, the Mediterranean Sea is to the north of Egypt, and then the cataracts to the south. All of these geographic landmarks provide natural barriers from invaders for the Egyptians. It's really hard to cross the desert, and if you're invading by sea, it's not going to be by surprise. Because of Egypt's location, though, Egypt was also a crossroads for civilization. Egypt connected Europe, Asia, and Africa and allowed for a lot of trade in that area. The Nile River was smack in the middle of Egypt, as stated before, and this provided the basis for survival. Many Egyptians were farmers living in small villages, and agriculture formed the economic base of the Egyptian civilization. The Nile River flooded annually, which provided the necessary irrigation and fertilization each year. However, if the Nile flooded too much, the crops were destroyed. If it flooded too little, there wasn't enough water to survive. The Egyptian government. Egypt was ruled by pharaohs, and pharaoh is a Greek word meaning great house. The Egyptian people themselves did not refer to their leaders as pharaohs. That's something that we've adapted today to call them. The pharaohs were divine representations of the gods, so they were considered both man and god. And the pharaohs were actually believed to be the god Horus, and so they were worshipped as deities. This made Egypt a theocratic monarchy, meaning that religion ruled the government. The pharaohs owned all of Egypt, were worshipped by the people, and were not only the head of the government, but also the high priest of every single temple, which means they had complete power. It also led to them becoming very incestuous. Because the pharaohs believed they were all powerful and they were gods, they didn't want to tarnish their blood by marrying commoners. And so they married within their own family, brother to sister, cousin to cousin, daughter to father. 4 very famous pharaohs are King Tut, Hatshepsut, Ramses, and Cleopatra. King Tut was the 18 or 19-year-old boy who died and was found recently in an intact tomb with all these riches and insight into his life. Hatshepsut was actually a female pharaoh who dressed like a man, wore a fake beard, and told everyone to refer to her as a male pharaoh. Ramses II is considered the most powerful of the Egyptian pharaohs and lived until his 90s. And then, of course, there's the famous Cleopatra, the last of the pharaohs. The pharaohs were at the top of the social hierarchy, which was very distinct, and that showed where you would be allowed to work, what kind of work you could do, if you could be educated or not, and who you could marry. At the top were the pharaohs, and at the bottom were the farmers and slaves. Many of these pharaohs asked to be buried in pyramids, although some were buried in tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Here you can see some pictures of the pyramids, arts, and architecture. In the top left-hand corner, you see the Great Sphinx at Giza. Top right-hand corner, we've got a temple We've got some paintings on the wall. And then, of course, we've got the Great Pyramid at Giza. And it's one of many pyramids in Giza right over here. And the Great Pyramid at Giza is known as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The pyramids were constructed as tombs for the pharaohs. And so they were very elaborate, they were very great, and the ancient Greek historian Herodotus actually estimated that it took 100,000 men 20 years to build the Great Pyramid. The Egyptian religion was polytheistic, meaning that they believed in many gods. They believed the gods or deities were present in the world and interacted with people. Some were human, some were animal, and some had animal heads but human bodies. It was very ritualistic, and there was a strong belief in the afterlife, hence the need for mummification. Mummification has actually helped preserve Egyptian bodies, which has taught us even more about the people. Let me tell you about the process. So first of all, the death is announced. Then the body is embalmed. Then the brain is removed by slurping it out of the nose. The internal organs are removed, the rest of the body is dried out, it is then wrapped up, and then there's the final procession before burial. And burial was very elaborate. Because Egyptians believed in the afterlife, they believed that they traveled to the afterlife with whatever possessions were buried with them, which means they wanted to be buried with all their possessions, all their riches, with slaves, with animals. And oftentimes the slaves and animals were buried alive with them. It also meant that there were many booby traps in these tombs because there were tomb raiders, right? Tomb robbers. People knew that if they went in there, they could get some jewels, and so there were these booby traps to catch anyone who would try and steal. There's also a strong connection within Egypt to both Judaism and Christianity. Some of you might know the story of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. It's a fairly popular story in both faiths of the Hebrew people who were enslaved by the Egyptians. Many think that the Egyptian pharaoh at that time was actually Ramses II. So the Hebrew people, they were suffering, they were struggling. And so Moses came, led them out of Egypt, he parted the Red Sea, and they went on to eventually make it to the Promised Land. Egyptian advancements, we have many. Hieroglyphics and writing, the calendar. They wrote on papyrus paper with ink. They invented clocks, they wore makeup and wigs. Many would actually shave their heads and then wear a wig instead. It was much cooler that way because Egypt is so hot. They had toothpaste, surgical tools, and surgery. Their medicine was extremely advanced. Obviously, they had mummification, pyramids, mathematics and geometry, surveying, astronomy. There was accounting. They created a ramp and a level to help build these pyramids. They used a plow, and they had an irrigation system to water their crops. Many of these advancements weren't found in other civilizations at that time. So then how did ancient Egypt fall? Over time, there were many different dynasties that ruled Egypt and many different people. At one point, the Persians were ruling Egypt up until 332 BC when Alexander the Great conquered the Persians and went into Egypt. He took over Egypt, but he was actually considered a liberator. When Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was divided into 3 parts, and one of his generals, Ptolemy, was left as Pharaoh of Egypt, and he started the line of Ptolemaic pharaohs. The last of the Ptolemaic pharaohs was Cleopatra, who lived until about 30 BC. Cleopatra was a young girl when she started ruling Egypt. She was extremely intelligent, very educated, and she loved Egypt. She wanted Egypt to be the most powerful place in the world. She saw to the north of her, though, was the Roman Empire. At this point in time, the Roman Empire was ruled by Julius Caesar, who was the most powerful man in the ancient world. And so, legend has it, Cleopatra snuck into his room in a rug, unveiled herself, and started a relationship with Caesar. The two of them had a son, but then Julius Caesar was brutally murdered by the senators, and so Cleopatra had to find someone else. She then began a relationship with another Roman ruler called Mark Antony. Her and Mark Antony seemed to be in love. However, Octavian, who was Julius Caesar's nephew, saw them as a threat. And so he started a war, Octavian and the Romans versus Cleopatra, Mark Antony and the Egyptians, and Rome did win. Rome is going to take over Egypt. Cleopatra, in her grief, is going to commit suicide. Many historians believe that she did this by allowing a snake to bite her. And with her death, the line of the pharaohs ended, and that is the end of ancient Egypt.